She found the divorce papers first. He found out too late. 12 years. 12 years Elena Vescari stood beside the most dangerous man on the East Coast. Through gunfire, through silence, through the kind of loneliness that doesn't have a name. She never asked for gratitude. She never asked for much at all. But the one night she followed her husband into the rain and watched him pull another woman against his chest like she was something he'd been starving for. That was the night Elena Vescari stopped asking for anything. If you've ever loved someone who stopped seeing you, stay until the end. Like this video, and drop the name of the city where you're watching. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came down hard that October, the kind that didn't announce itself. It simply arrived and made everything cold and gray and final. Damiano Vescari stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study on the third floor of the Vescari estate, watching the water streak down the glass in crooked lines. He had a glass of Barolo in his hand, barely touched. The estate was quiet in the way that large, expensive houses always seemed quiet. Not peaceful, but hollow, like the silence was filling a space that used to hold something else. He was 51 years old and had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 11 months. He told himself it was the business. There was always something. A territory dispute in Newark, a shipment delayed out of the port, a captain who'd started talking to people he shouldn't be talking to. Damiano Vescari had built his operation from a single block in South Philadelphia into something that stretched from Boston to Baltimore, and empires did not maintain themselves. They demanded attention. Constant, grinding, sleepless attention. That was what he told himself. He did not think about Elena, or rather, he thought about her the way a man thinks about a back tooth that's been aching for months. He knew it was there. He knew something was wrong. He kept choosing not to deal with it. She was downstairs. She was always somewhere in the house, moving quietly through it like she was trying not to disturb the furniture. He had noticed, in some distant, unexamined part of himself, that she had stopped trying to reach him at dinner. She used to ask about his day in that careful way she had, not probing, not demanding, just leaving a door open in case he wanted to walk through it. Somewhere in the last year she had stopped opening the door. He had not asked why. The rain intensified. He finished the wine and went to bed. He had met Serena Moretti on a Tuesday in March, 13 years ago, at a fundraising dinner for a mayoral candidate who would later do 3 years in federal prison. She had been on the arm of a real estate developer with connections Damiano had wanted access to. She was the kind of woman who understood rooms, who was important, who was pretending, who was dangerous. She had looked at Damiano across a table of oysters and overpriced champagne and said, very quietly, "You're the only honest person here. Everyone else is selling something." He had laughed. He had been 38 years old and still stupid enough to think that kind of thing was a compliment. They had lasted 14 months. It had ended badly. She'd left suddenly, no explanation, no forwarding address, no final scene. He had told himself he was relieved. He had married Elena 8 months later, a woman he had known for 3 years and trusted completely, a woman whose steadiness felt, after Serena, like the first solid ground he'd stood on in a long time. He had not thought about Serena Moretti in years, or so he believed. She appeared on a Wednesday morning in late September, sitting in the lobby of the building on Chestnut Street where Damiano held his legitimate business interests, a commercial real estate development company that employed 22 people and existed primarily to explain his income to the federal government. His office manager, a careful woman named Greta, had come to find him personally rather than call. "There's someone in the lobby," Greta said. "She doesn't have an appointment. She says her name is Serena Moretti and that you'll want to see her." He had felt something move through his chest, something quick and involuntary, like the flinch before an impact. He told Greta to send her up. Serena Moretti at 44 looked almost exactly like Serena Moretti at 31. That was the first thing he noticed, and tried not to show that he noticed. She wore a gray wool coat and no jewelry except for a single thin bracelet on her right wrist. She sat down across from his desk without being invited to, and crossed her legs and looked at him the way she always had, like she was calculating something slightly faster than the conversation was moving. "You look tired," she said. "You disappeared for 13 years, he said. "What do you want?" She told him a story. It was a long story, and parts of it were almost certainly untrue, but the bones of it were this. She had left because she'd gotten involved with people she shouldn't have. People connected to a man named Vincent Traore, who ran a mid-sized operation out of Atlantic City and had been trying for years to find a soft point in Damiano's structure. She said she'd been running from that association ever since. She said she'd come back because Traore's people had found her again, and she had nowhere else to go. Damiano listened. He did not move from behind his desk. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Why would I help you?" he said. "Because you're the only person in this city with enough standing to make them leave me alone," she said, "and because you know I'm not stupid enough to walk in here with a lie." He should have told her to get out. He knew that. He felt it clearly, the way you feel a wrong turn the moment you take it. That slight internal lurch, the sense that the road ahead is not the road you meant to be on. He had 50 men who handled problems like this. He had lawyers and fixers and people who existed specifically to make uncomfortable situations disappear. He did not need to manage this personally. "I'll look into it," he said. "Come back Thursday." She came back Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the one after that. Elena noticed the shift the way she noticed most things about Damiano, obliquely, from the corner of her vision, the way you register a shadow moving without looking directly at the light. It was not any single thing. It was the texture of him changing. He started taking calls outside. Not unusual. He often took calls outside, in the garden or in the car, for privacy, or because the house had staff who talked. But now he took them later, after 10, walking the perimeter of the property in the dark while she lay in bed watching the ceiling. She had learned long ago not to ask what was said on those calls. That was part of their arrangement, unspoken and durable. She did not ask about the business, and in exchange he kept the business away from her life as much as a man in his position could. But this felt different. She could not have explained why. The calls were quieter. When he came back inside, there was a look on his face she didn't recognize immediately. It took her a week to name it. It was the look of someone thinking about something they didn't want to stop thinking about. She told herself she was imagining it. She had spent 12 years learning to talk herself out of the fear that accumulated naturally in the life she'd chosen, and she applied that same discipline now. She was imagining it. He was under pressure. The business had rough seasons and smooth ones. She knew better than to mistake his distraction for something it wasn't. She kept the house running. She managed his schedule for the events that required her presence: the civic dinners, the charity auctions, the Christmas party for the legitimate company's employees. She handled his mother, Carmela, who was 73 and suspicious of everyone, and had never fully decided whether she approved of Elena or merely tolerated her. She made sure there was always food in the house, and that the staff were paid on time, and that the small infrastructure of their life together continued to function smoothly. She did these things not out of submission, but out of the habit of competence. Elena Vescari had always been organized, had always been capable, had always known that the people around her ran better when someone was holding the machinery together without announcing it. She had just not anticipated how invisible that made her. The first time she saw Serena Moretti was an accident. She had driven to Damiano's office building to drop off a jacket he'd left at the dry cleaner, something she'd picked up on her way back from a lunch with Carmela, a small, practical errand that had required no thought. She'd parked on the street and was crossing the lobby when she saw them in the elevator vestibule, not touching, not doing anything that would read to a stranger as anything more than a business conversation. They were standing a normal distance apart, and Damiano was talking, and Serena was listening with that particular quality of attention that some women had: total, focused, slightly dangerous. Elena stopped walking. She could not have said what she felt in that moment. It was not fully formed yet. It was more like weather changing, the air pressure shifting before the storm actually arrives. She noticed the woman's face. She noticed the way Damiano's body had changed its posture, looser somehow, less guarded. She noticed that his hands, which he usually kept still when he spoke, were moving slightly. The elevator opened. Serena stepped in. Damiano turned and saw Elena standing in the middle of the lobby. His face went through several things very quickly. She caught all of them. "Elena." He crossed the lobby toward her. "What are you doing here?" "I brought your jacket," she said. She held it out. Her voice was completely steady. She was proud of that and ashamed of being proud of it simultaneously. He took the jacket. He kissed her on the cheek. "You didn't have to come all this way." "It was on my way." She looked toward the elevator, which had closed. Who was that? A pause. Very brief. If she hadn't been watching for it, she might have missed it. A client, he said. Commercial property question. Nothing interesting. He touched her arm. You want to come up? I can clear 30 minutes. No, she said. I have to get back. She drove home. She sat in the car in the garage for 12 minutes before going inside. She started watching him differently. She hated herself for it. The surveillance instinct felt like a betrayal of her own dignity, like she was becoming a smaller version of herself. But she couldn't stop. She noticed things she had been successfully not noticing for weeks. The second phone, which she'd assumed was a security measure his people required. The nights he came home after midnight smelling like cold air and cigarette smoke, which he'd quit 4 years ago. The way he answered questions about his day with answers that were technically accurate and completely empty. She searched nothing. She followed nothing. She went on as she had been going, managing the house and the schedule, and Carmela's complaints and the quiet loneliness that had been her companion for years now, only louder. She told herself she needed more evidence before she allowed herself to feel what she was already feeling. She was not naive. She had known who Damiano Vescari was when she married him. She had known the world he moved through, the compromises it demanded, the way it eroded things over time. She had accepted those terms with open eyes because she had believed, had genuinely, completely believed, that what existed between them was solid enough to absorb the weight of his life. She was beginning to understand that she might have been wrong about that. The night she followed him was a Thursday in early October. The rain had started mid-afternoon and hadn't let up. She had told herself she wasn't going to do it. She had made dinner, set the table, waited. He had texted at 7. Don't wait up. Something came up. She had sat at the dinner table alone for 20 minutes, looking at the 2 plates she'd set, and then she'd put on her coat and gotten in her car. She knew his roots. 12 years of listening to him talk about the city had given her a detailed interior map of where he went and why. She picked him up, 2 cars back, headlights off for stretches, on the expressway heading northwest. She followed him for 40 minutes to a neighborhood she didn't recognize. Older houses, large lots, the kind of area that had been expensive once and was waiting to be expensive again. He pulled up outside a house that was dark except for a single light in an upper window. She parked half a block back. She waited 11 minutes. The front door opened. Serena Moretti stepped out, and Damiano was right behind her. They stood on the covered porch out of the rain, and they spoke for a few minutes. Low voices, Elena couldn't hear anything. And then Serena said something that made Damiano laugh. And it was not the laugh he used in public or in business. It was the other one, the unguarded one, the laugh she had not heard him use in a very long time. Then Serena stepped forward and put her arms around him, and Damiano closed his eyes and held her like someone coming in from the cold. Elena sat in her car and watched. She did not cry. She found that strange later, that there were no tears, not then, not in the car, not during the drive home. What she felt was more like the final click of a lock engaging, some mechanism inside her reaching the end of its range of motion and stopping. She drove home in the rain. She did not sleep. She sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and waited for the feeling to tell her what to do. It told her very clearly. By 3 in the morning, she had found the divorce paperwork she'd requested from an attorney 6 weeks ago. She had not let herself examine why she'd requested it, had filed it away, telling herself it was simply good to know what the process looked like. And she spent an hour reading through it at the kitchen table, in the quiet of the house, while the rain tapped steadily against the windows. She signed it. She dated it. She stood up and walked to the marble dining table in the formal room. The room they'd used for important dinners, the room where Damiano had once told her she was the only thing in his life that made the rest of it worth enduring. And she set the papers in the center of it. She went upstairs. She pulled a suitcase from the top of the closet and packed it with the careful efficiency of a woman who had spent her life managing logistics. She packed what she needed and left what she didn't, including her wedding ring, which she set on the nightstand on her side of the bed. She carried the suitcase downstairs. She stood in the foyer for a moment, looking at the house, the staircase, the art on the walls, the flowers she'd arranged 2 days ago still sitting in their vase. still perfectly fresh. She picked up her suitcase and walked out the front door. The rain had stopped. The street was wet and empty and very quiet. She put her suitcase in the trunk of her car, got in, and started driving. She did not look back at the house. She did not know exactly where she was going, only that it was away. And for the first time in 12 years, away felt like the only direction that made any sense at all. Damiano's headlights would appear in the driveway just before 6 in the morning. He would let himself in with his key. He would smell the coffee she had made and left in the pot. He would walk through the foyer and the hallway and into the formal dining room, where the first gray light of morning was falling across the marble table. And he would see the papers sitting there. Damiano found the coffee first. That was the detail that stayed with him afterward, longer than it should have, the fact that she had made coffee before she left. The pot was still warm when he came through the kitchen at 5:53 in the morning, and he poured a cup without thinking, the way he had poured 1,000 cups in this kitchen, and he stood at the counter drinking it before something in the quality of the house's silence made him stop. It was too quiet. Not the quiet of a sleeping house. Something else. He set the cup down. He walked through the kitchen into the hallway, past the staircase, and into the formal dining room, and he saw the papers on the marble table from the doorway. He knew what they were before he crossed the room. He knew the way you know bad news that has been coming for a long time, not with surprise, but with the sick, hollow feeling of something finally arriving that you'd been pretending wasn't on its way. He picked them up. He read them standing there in the gray morning light, still in his coat, still smelling like rain, and Serena's perfume, and the particular shame of a man who has been somewhere he should not have been. Elena's signature was at the bottom, clean and even, the same handwriting she used for grocery lists and thank you notes, and the birthday card she sent to his captain's wives every year without being asked. He set the papers back down on the table. He went upstairs. Her closet was half empty in the specific way that told him she had not packed in a panic. She had packed with intention, taking what she needed and leaving what she didn't, the way a person packs when they are not planning to come back. Her wedding ring was on the nightstand. He stood looking at it for a long time without touching it. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands. He did not call anyone. Not yet. He sat there in the early morning silence of a house that had always been more hers than his. She had chosen the furniture, chosen the paint colors, chosen the flowers that sat in their vase downstairs still perfectly fresh. And he tried to locate, somewhere inside himself, a feeling he could act on. What he found instead was a flatness so complete it frightened him slightly. He had not cried since his father's funeral, 22 years ago. He did not cry now. He simply sat. He called Marco Vitelli at 7:30. Marco was his second, had been for 9 years. A lean, careful man of 53 who had survived in the organization primarily by being the person Damiano could talk to without managing what he said. Marco arrived at the estate within the hour and found Damiano in the study, the divorce papers on the desk in front of him, the coffee cup from the kitchen still in his hand, stone cold. Marco looked at the papers. He looked at Damiano. He did not say anything right away, which was one of the things that made him valuable. "She's gone," Damiano said. "Where?" "I don't know." Marco pulled a chair from the wall and sat down across from the desk. He laced his fingers together and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "How long has this been building?" Damiano set down the coffee cup. "Longer than I let myself see." "The Moretti woman." It wasn't a question. Damiano looked at him. "You knew." "I knew something was pulling your attention sideways." Marco's voice was even, not accusatory, just accurate. "The men noticed. I didn't think it was my place to—" "The men noticed." Damiano said it flatly. Caruso made a comment. I shut it down. "But yes." Damiano stood up from behind the desk and walked to the window. The property looked washed and still after the rain, the lawn very green, the gravel drive gleaming. He had bought this estate because Elena had loved the garden. He could still remember the afternoon they'd walked through it with the realtor, the way she'd stopped at the rose beds and gone quiet in that way she had when something genuinely moved her. "She'll come back," he said. "She needs time." Marco was quiet. "She always comes back from things." "Damiano, Marco's voice was careful but not soft. She took her clothes. I know what she took. She signed the papers before she left. She didn't leave them unsigned, waiting for a conversation. She signed them. Damiano did not turn from the window. His jaw worked once, twice. I heard you. I'm not saying it to cause pain. I'm saying it because you need to understand what you're actually dealing with here. What I'm dealing with, Damiano said, is a marriage that is not over because I say it isn't over. Marco said nothing. That particular silence was the kind that meant he disagreed entirely and knew that saying so again would accomplish nothing. He'd used that silence on Damiano before, over business decisions, and Damiano had occasionally been grateful for it later. He did not feel grateful now. Find her, Damiano said, quietly. I just want to know she's safe. And if she doesn't want to be found, find her anyway. The week that followed was the worst week Damiano Vescari had experienced since the federal indictment 8 years ago that had taken 2 of his senior people and cost him 3 territories and 14 months of legal fees that made his accountant visibly age. It was worse in some ways because, at least during the indictment, he had known what he was fighting and how to fight it. This had no shape he could attack. He went through the motions of the business. He took meetings, reviewed numbers, settled a dispute between 2 of his crews in Camden that had been simmering for weeks and was in danger of becoming something that drew attention. He did these things with the mechanical competence of a man who had been doing them for so long they required no active thought, and behind that competence his mind moved in slow, grinding circles around the marble table and the signed papers and the cold coffee and the wedding ring. His mother called on the 3rd day. Carmela Vescari was 73 and had lived through her husband's imprisonment, his death, her oldest son's death at 31, in a dispute that no one ever fully explained to her, and 30 years of knowing things about her remaining son's life that no mother should have to know. She had not survived all of that by being gentle. Tell me what happened, she said when Damiano answered. No preamble. Elena left. A pause. Why? It's complicated. It's never complicated, Carmela said. People say complicated when they mean they don't want to say the simple true thing. What did you do? Damiano rubbed the back of his neck. He was standing in the kitchen, in the same spot where he'd found the coffee 4 days ago, and he'd been standing there for some reason he couldn't fully explain, returning to that spot the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. There was a woman, someone from before Elena. Silence on the line. When Carmela spoke again, her voice had gone to the particular temperature it reached when she was controlling something larger underneath. You brought another woman into your house. Not into the house. Into your life while Elena was in that house. A breath. Damiano. I know. You don't know. If you knew, we wouldn't be having this conversation. A pause. Elena is a good woman. She has always been a good woman. Whatever I may have said about her over the years, whatever I may have said, she held your household together with both hands for 12 years. She never complained to me, never once. Do you know how rare that is? A woman in her position who never once came to me to complain? Damiano said nothing. She loved you more than you deserved, Carmela said. And I'm your mother. I'm allowed to say that. She paused. Who is this woman? Her name is Serena Moretti. We were involved before Elena. She came back recently, claimed she needed help with a situation. And you believed her? I'm not sure what I believed. That, Carmela said, is the problem. A man who doesn't know what he believes is a man who can be led anywhere. She was quiet for a moment. Find Elena. Not to drag her back, I'm not telling you that. But find her and make sure she's safe. That's still your responsibility whether she's your wife or not. She hung up. Damiano stood in the kitchen for a while after the call ended, his phone in his hand, the line dead. Marco found Elena on the 8th day. He came to Damiano privately. In the study, door closed, the same way he brought information that required discretion. She was in a coastal town in Delaware, a small place called Morro Bay, population roughly 4,000. She was renting a furnished apartment above a bookshop on the main street. She was using her maiden name, Caruso, not Elena Caruso Vescari, just Elena Caruso, as if she had surgically removed the last 12 years from her identity. She's fine, Marco said. Healthy. She's been seen at the market, at a coffee place on the waterfront. She looks... He paused, choosing the word with visible care. Calm. Damiano had expected to feel relief at hearing she was safe. What he felt instead was something stranger and more uncomfortable, a kind of loss that was sharper than what he'd felt standing at her empty closet. She was calm. 8 days after leaving, she was calm. He had not slept a complete night since she walked out the door, and she was calm. Leave her alone, he said. Marco nodded. And the Moretti situation? What about it? She's still calling. She's been asking to meet. Damiano looked at his desk. The divorce papers were in the drawer now. He'd put them there so he didn't have to look at them, which had not worked as intended because now he was constantly aware of the drawer. Tell her I'm busy. I've told her that twice. Tell her again. The meeting with his 3 senior captains was scheduled for Thursday of that week, and Damiano had considered canceling it, but canceling would have signaled something he wasn't prepared to signal. He sat at the head of the long table in the room they used for these meetings, a back room in a restaurant on Broad Street that they'd been using for 11 years. And he watched the faces of the 3 men across from him and knew that Marco had been right. They had noticed. Sal Benedetto, who ran the port operations and was 61 and had the blunt, weathered quality of a man who had worked with his hands before he'd worked with his mind, opened it. Not directly. Sal never did anything directly if he could come at it sideways, but he opened it. The Fabretti situation, Sal said. He was referring to a territory dispute in Cherry Hill that had been ongoing for 3 months and which Damiano had been handling with a patience his captains found confusing. We need a decision. They're reading the delay as weakness. The delay is strategy, Damiano said. I understand that. But what reads as strategy from inside this room reads different from outside it. Sal paused. There's been some talk. Talk, Damiano repeated. Nothing serious, just the kind of talk that starts when people think a man's attention is somewhere else. Damiano looked at him steadily. Sal met his eyes without flinching, which was either bravery or a very good performance of it. What kind of talk? Sal spread his hands. The kind I told you about. The other 2 men, Nico Ferrante and Carlo De Luca, were very still, looking at the table, occupying the particular careful stillness of men who had survived long careers by knowing when not to be visible. You want to tell me something, Damiano said. Tell me. Sal exhaled slowly. The Fabretti crew has been meeting with someone. We think it's a contact for a third party interested in the port routes, someone who would benefit from this organization looking distracted right now. Who? We're still confirming. Then confirm faster. Damiano's voice had gone very even, very quiet, the tone his people recognized and did not enjoy. And I want to hear the rest of the talk you mentioned, not the summary, the actual conversation, who said what, to whom, and when. Sal told him. It took 12 minutes. By the end of it, Damiano understood that what had begun as a rumor, that he had grown soft, that his personal situation had made him vulnerable, had already traveled further than a rumor should have traveled, and that traveling was not an accident. Rumors in this business did not spread on their own. Someone was feeding it. He looked at his captains. Find out who's talking and why, he said. Don't move on it until you come back to me. But find out. The meeting ended. He sat alone in the room for a while after they left. Serena was waiting outside the restaurant. He saw her when he came through the back and walked the length of the side alley to where his car was parked. She was leaning against the wall at the alley's mouth, collar up against the October wind, and she straightened when she saw him, the way a person straightens when they've been waiting a long time and are trying not to show it. I told Marco I was busy, Damiano said. He did not stop walking. She fell into step beside him. Marco's been saying that for a week. I need to talk to you. I don't have time. Damiano. Her hand caught his arm, and he stopped. She took her hand off his arm immediately. She knew him well enough for that. I know about Elena. He looked at her. I know she left. I'm sorry. I know that's... You know nothing about it, he said. His voice was very quiet. I'm not trying to use it. I just want you to know that what happened between us, I didn't intend for it to hurt her. I didn't set out to. Serena. He said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. What is it you need? She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face. He had always been able to read her reasonably well, but there was something beneath this current expression he couldn't quite reach. The people I told you about. Traore's people. They've made contact again. They're making a specific request. What kind of request? They want information about your port operations. Damiano went completely still. The wind moved between them, cold and smelling like exhaust and wet pavement. They asked you. Yes. And you came to tell me. Of course I came to tell you. He looked at her for a long time. A car moved past the alley's mouth, headlights sweeping briefly across them. He thought about Marco's report. The Fabretti crew meeting with an unknown third party. He thought about the rumor traveling further than it should. He thought about Serena appearing in his lobby 6 weeks ago with a story that had exactly the right amount of detail, not too much, not too little, and exactly the right emotional weight. He thought about Elena standing in the hotel lobby with her jacket, seeing Serena for the first time, her face doing several things very quickly that she had then locked back down behind the composure she was so extraordinarily good at maintaining. Something cold moved through him. Not anger. Something quieter than anger and more dangerous. What exactly did they ask you for? He said. Route schedules, shipment timing, names of the port contacts. And what did you tell them? Nothing. That's why I'm here. He held her gaze. She held his. The wind pushed a piece of newspaper down the alley between them. All right, he said. I'll handle it. Don't meet with them again without telling me first. She nodded. Something in her posture relaxed, very slightly, almost imperceptibly. If he hadn't been watching for it, he might have missed it. He got in his car. He sat behind the wheel and did not start the engine. Through the windshield, he watched her walk to the corner and turn and disappear. The cold thing in his chest didn't go away. He started the engine and drove, and the whole way home he kept coming back to one thing he couldn't dislodge. She had told him that Traore's people wanted port route information, and she had said it with the specific vocabulary of someone who already knew which information was valuable. Not business details, not your operations, but port routes, shipment timing, names of contacts. He had never told her anything about his port operations. He had never discussed the port with her at all. He pulled into the estate's drive and sat in the car in the dark for a long moment, his hands on the wheel, and understood that what he was now looking at was not the shape of a woman who had come back to him because she was frightened and had nowhere else to go. He was looking at the shape of something that had been built, carefully and patiently, around the softest point in his life. And Elena, somewhere in a rented room above a bookshop in a town called Morro Bay, had already walked out of it before it could close around her too. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the study with the lights off and the window open despite the cold. And he thought about port routes and shipment timing and the specific vocabulary of a woman who should not have known either. He thought about the sequence of it, Serena appearing in September, the conversations that had followed, the way each one had drawn him slightly further from his desk and his captains, and the operational discipline that had kept him alive and functional for 2 decades. He thought about the rumor that had traveled further than rumors should travel, and the Fabretti crew meeting with an unknown contact, and the cold arithmetic of it assembled itself in the dark with the slow grinding certainty of something that had always been true and was only now becoming visible. He picked up his phone at 2 a.m. and called a man named Ruiz. Ruiz was not part of the organization in any formal sense. He was a private investigator who had worked for Damiano periodically over 15 years, a former federal analyst who had left that work under circumstances he never discussed, and whose usefulness resided precisely in the fact that he operated completely outside any structure Damiano's enemies might be watching. Damiano had used him twice in the last decade, once to locate a man who had disappeared with organizational funds, and once to determine whether a judge in the federal district was genuinely independent or had prior connections to a rival operation. Ruiz answered on the 3rd ring, alert despite the hour, which was one of the things Damiano paid for. I need a full background on a woman named Serena Moretti, Damiano said. Specifically the last 13 years. Where she went when she left Philadelphia in 2011, who she was with, what she was doing. I need it fast. How fast? 72 hours. A pause. That's aggressive. I know, double your rate. Give me what you have on her. Damiano gave him everything. Her age, the real estate developer she'd been connected to 13 years ago, the story she'd told him about Traore and his people, her current address as far as he knew it. When he finished, Ruiz was quiet for a moment. This connected to the divorce? Ruiz asked. Damiano was silent. I hear things, Ruiz said without apology. I'm not asking for details. I'm asking because if it is, I want to make sure I'm looking at the right angle. Look at all the angles, Damiano said. Come back to me in 72 hours. He hung up and sat in the dark for another hour, and sometime around 3:30 he fell asleep in the chair with his coat still on, his phone in his hand, and did not dream. Marco came to him the next morning with the name. He came in without knocking, which he only did when the information couldn't wait, and he put a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of Damiano. A printed photograph, slightly grainy, taken with a long lens from some distance. It showed two people in conversation outside what appeared to be a parking garage. One of them was a man Damiano did not recognize. The other was Serena. Our guy on the Fabretti situation, Marco said. He got a photo of the third-party contact they've been meeting with. We ran it through our sources. He tapped the unrecognized man in the photograph. His name is Derek Lund. He's a logistics coordinator for a company called Meridian Freight, which is a legitimate operation on paper. Behind the paper, Meridian is 40% owned through a series of shell companies by a holding group that traces back to Vincent Traore. Damiano looked at the photograph. He did not touch it. So Traore has a man inside the Fabretti meetings, he said. Yes. And Lund has been meeting with the Fabrettis twice a week for the last 6 weeks. Marco paused. 6 weeks ago is when Serena Moretti came back. The room was very quiet. Damiano could hear the house settling around them, the small sounds of a large building responding to temperature change. She's working for him, Damiano said. It was not a question. It looks that way. What does Traore want? The port. Marco sat down. He's been trying to get a foothold in our port operations for 4 years. He came close twice, and both times we pushed him back. This time, he stopped. This time he came at it differently, Damiano said. He came at it through you, through something that would pull your attention off the operations and onto something personal. Something that would make you, Marco chose his next word carefully, available. Damiano sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. The plasterwork up there was elaborate, something Elena had pointed out to him once when they'd first moved in. She'd found the original architect's drawings and shown him the detail, pleased in that quiet way she had when something exceeded what it needed to be. He had looked at the ceiling and seen a ceiling. She had looked at it and seen intention. She knew about the port, Damiano said. Last night, outside the restaurant, she used the specific language, routes, timing, contacts. I never told her any of that. Traore would have briefed her on what to ask for, what to say to make you believe she was genuinely warning you. A test, Damiano said. She came to warn me as a test, to see if I'd trust her, to keep me close, and to keep you looking at Traore as an external threat instead of understanding that she was the vector. Damiano closed his eyes for a moment. 3 seconds. Then he opened them and looked at Marco. How deep does it go? Marco's expression did not change, but something behind it did. We think she has a contact inside the organization. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the ones before it. Damiano felt it physically, a tightening across his shoulders, a heaviness at the base of his throat. Who? He said. We're not certain yet, but the information that's been traveling, about your attention being elsewhere, about the timing of the Fabretti outreach, that's not public information. It's the kind of information that comes from someone who sits in rooms with us. You have a guess. I have a suspicion I'm not ready to name until I'm sure. Name it anyway. Marco looked at him. Caruso. Tommy Caruso. 28 years old, 3 years in the organization, nephew of a man who had worked for Damiano's father. He ran errands, sat in on lower-level meetings, had been slowly working his way toward a more substantial role. He was young and ambitious, and had, now that Damiano thought about it, been present in the building on Chestnut Street on at least 2 of the days Serena had visited. "Find out," Damiano said, quietly. "Don't move on him." "Understood." "And Marco?" Damiano's voice was flat and very controlled. "Nobody talks to Serena Moretti without my knowledge. If she calls, if she texts, if she shows up somewhere, I hear about it within the hour." Ruiz called back in 51 hours, not 72. He called at 6 in the evening, and Damiano took the call in his car, parked in the estate's garage with the engine off and the door closed. He listened without interrupting for 11 minutes while Ruiz talked, and when Ruiz finished, Damiano sat with the phone in his hand and the information settling into him like something very heavy being slowly lowered onto a surface that could barely hold the weight. Serena Moretti had not spent 13 years running from Vincent Traore. She had spent those 13 years working for him. The relationship had begun in 2012, approximately 8 months after she left Philadelphia, not as a coerced involvement, not as something she'd been trapped into, but as a deliberate professional arrangement initiated by Serena herself. She had approached Traore's organization through an intermediary, offering specific value. Her knowledge of Damiano Vescari's personal patterns, his decision-making tendencies, his emotional vulnerabilities, acquired during 14 months of intimate contact. Traore had recognized the long-term value of this and had employed her accordingly. Over the following decade, she had worked in various capacities, sometimes as a direct operative, sometimes as an intelligence gatherer, sometimes simply waiting, maintained at Traore's expense, in a series of comfortable situations until the moment she would be most useful. That moment, Ruiz had determined, had been carefully calculated to coincide with a specific point in Traore's larger strategy against Damiano's port operations, a moment when Traore needed not just information but disruption, internal chaos. A Vescari organization whose leadership was distracted, emotionally compromised, and beginning to show fractures that rivals could exploit. Serena's return had not been improvised. It had been timed, and the encounter outside the abandoned house, the one Elena had seen, had not been spontaneous either. Ruiz had spoken with a source who had information about Traore's operational planning. The source had confirmed that the encounter had been staged at a location Serena had suggested, at a time she had known Elena was likely to be traceable. She had known about Elena's habit of occasionally following Damiano when her anxiety became too much to contain, not because Elena had ever been obvious about it, but because Serena had spent weeks in preparation, learning the household's patterns through the kind of patient, granular observation that professional intelligence work required. Elena had not accidentally discovered the affair. She had been directed to discover it. Damiano sat in the dark garage for a long time after the call ended. He did not move. His hands rested on the wheel and his eyes were fixed on the garage door, and his mind was doing something he couldn't quite describe. Not thinking exactly, not feeling exactly, but processing, the way a system processes an input that is too large for its normal capacity, slowly and with a kind of grinding effort. Elena had been a target, not collateral damage. A target. Serena had identified her as the most effective point of destabilization, not because destroying the marriage would hurt Damiano directly, though it would, but because Elena had been the organizational intelligence Serena and Traore had correctly understood they could not penetrate or corrupt. Elena, who had never been officially part of the organization, but whose competence and steadiness had held it together from the inside, whose relationships with the captains' families and whose management of the household's social infrastructure had made her a structural element that no org chart acknowledged, but that everyone who depended on it felt. Remove Elena, and you introduced a fracture that ran through the entire operation. Damiano had given Traore that fracture. He had provided it himself, willingly, with his eyes mostly open, and the part of him that still remembered Serena's voice from 14 months a decade ago drowning out the part that should have known better. He got out of the car. He went inside. He poured 3 fingers of whiskey and did not drink it. He stood at the kitchen counter, in the spot where he kept returning, and he thought about Elena signing those papers at 3 in the morning with the rain on the windows, and the coffee going in the pot, and the careful, dignified efficiency with which she had packed her life into one suitcase. She had deserved better than this. She had deserved better than him, if he was being exact about it, and some part of him had always known that and had chosen not to examine it too closely. He picked up his phone and called Marco. "Set it up," he said. "I want to talk to Serena tomorrow." He met her at the house on Chestnut Street, in his office, at 9 in the morning. He had chosen the office deliberately. Familiar ground, controlled space, no ambient noise that could cover sounds or interfere with his ability to read her. He had Marco outside the door and 2 of his men in the building and a recording device running from the moment she stepped off the elevator. She came in confident. That was the first thing. She was wearing the gray wool coat again, and she looked composed, and she sat down in the chair across from his desk and crossed her legs and looked at him with that slightly ahead of the conversation quality she always carried. He let her sit in silence for a moment. He watched her. He was looking for the place where the confidence had a seam, and he found it in the second 6 seconds, a very slight adjustment of her posture, a fractional repositioning that someone who hadn't spent considerable time watching her would not have caught. She was working to hold the expression. "You look tired," she said. The same thing she'd said the first day. A callback. A warmth signal. "Tell me about Meridian Freight," he said. The confidence didn't collapse. He'd expected it not to. She was good. Ruiz had confirmed she was genuinely trained, and good people didn't break on the first hit. But he watched the warmth signal die. What replaced it was something more careful, something that was making calculations. "I don't know what that is," she said. "Derek Lund." A pause. Barely perceptible. "I don't know that name either." "Serena." He said her name the same way he'd said it outside the restaurant, like a period. "I've spent 51 hours. I know what the last 13 years looked like. I know when you made contact, and I know the arrangement, and I know what you were maintained to do, and I know why you came back in September specifically." He paused. "I know about the house in Morro Bay District. Not Morro Bay itself, the district surveillance, the pattern mapping. I know she was directed toward that porch." Something happened in Serena's face then. Not guilt. He wasn't expecting guilt and didn't see it. What he saw was a recalibration, a person deciding that the cover story was finished and deciding what came next. "You're smarter than he thought you'd be," she said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was entirely gone. What was left was something professional and flat and oddly more honest than anything she'd said to him in 6 weeks. "How long?" Damiano said. 13 years. "From the beginning. When you left." "From about 8 months after." "Did you leave because of him, or were you already—" "I left because the timing was right. I'd gotten what was needed from the first phase." A pause. "I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear." Damiano looked at her. He felt strangely very little. He had expected rage, and instead there was something like the flat aftermath of an explosion. Everything leveled, quiet, the air still carrying the heat of what had just gone through it. "The affair. The house that night. You arranged it." "I identified the pattern and created the opportunity. She did the rest herself. I didn't force her to follow you." Serena met his eyes without difficulty. "That part I need you to understand. She saw something real. It wasn't performed. What she saw was real. You engineered the conditions." "Yes." "And the purpose was to remove her from the equation." Serena was quiet for a moment. "The purpose was to destabilize the structure. She was load-bearing in ways that weren't visible until she was gone." She said it with the clean, impersonal quality of an analyst describing a system. Traore understood that. I confirmed it. Damiano stood up from behind the desk. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking at the street below. A woman pushed a stroller on the opposite sidewalk, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. An ordinary Wednesday morning in an ordinary city. "Where is he?" Damiano said. "I'm not going to tell you that." "Serena." "I'm not going to tell you that," she said again, without emphasis. "Not because I'm protecting him, because it won't help you. He's already moved. The Fabretti connection has been cut. He'll have known within 48 hours of your Thursday meeting that the captains were closing in on it. He's 3 steps ahead operationally." She paused. "The damage is done. The question now is whether you're willing to deal." Damiano turned from the window. "Deal." He wants the port routes, not the whole operation, just the Meridian corridor. 1 season. He'll compensate at market rate and withdraw the internal contact and end the campaign. "The internal contact," Damiano said. "Tommy Caruso." A fractional hesitation. Confirmation without speech. "And in exchange, I hand Traore a corridor in my port operation. In exchange, you stabilize. The rumors stop, the Fabrettis pull back, your captains stop questioning your leadership." She looked at him steadily. "And you get to focus on rebuilding what you lost, if that's what you want to do." Damiano looked at her for a long time. The recording device was running. He was aware of it with one part of his mind, the way you're aware of something peripheral, a background detail that might matter later. "Get out," he said. She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back to look at him with something that might, in a different life, have been genuine. "For what it's worth," she said, "she was the right choice. She always was. You just never looked at what you had directly enough to know it." "Get out of my building," Damiano said. The door closed. He stood in the empty office for a moment, then moved to his desk and opened the drawer where the recording device sat, checked that it had captured everything cleanly. It had. He closed the drawer. He picked up his phone and called Marco and said 5 words. "Bring me Tommy Caruso now." Then he sat down and did something he had not done since his father's funeral, and would not, he suspected, do again for a very long time. He put his face in his hands and stayed there, in the quiet office, for 60 seconds that felt like something much longer, while the full weight of what Serena had confirmed settled into him like cold water finding the lowest point in a broken vessel. Elena had not been collateral damage in someone else's war. Elena had been the war. And he had handed her over without a fight, without even understanding there was a fight to be had, because he had been too busy looking at a woman from his past to see what was being dismantled right in front of him. When he raised his head, his face was dry and his jaw was set, and something in his eyes had gone to a place it did not come back from easily. He had one internal traitor to remove, one enemy to dismantle, and one war to finish. And somewhere in a town called Morro Bay, in a rented room above a bookshop, was the only person who had ever mattered in any of it, living her life in the calm, careful way she had always lived it. And she did not know yet that the thing that had broken her marriage had been built specifically to break it. He did not know if telling her would change anything. He knew, with the certainty of a man who has just lost the last of his illusions, that he owed her the truth regardless. Tommy Caruso arrived at the Chestnut Street building at 10:47 in the morning, 40 minutes after Damiano made the call. Marco brought him up personally, which Tommy would have understood as a signal if he'd been paying attention. Marco did not personally escort junior members anywhere. That was not how the hierarchy worked. And the fact that he'd come to Tommy's apartment himself, rather than sending a message through normal channels, should have told the young man something. But Tommy Caruso was 28 years old and had spent 3 years learning to read rooms from the outside. And he still didn't know how to read them from the inside. And he came through the office door with his shoulders back and his chin up in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed a version of being calm. Damiano was standing at the window when Tommy came in. He didn't turn around right away. He let the silence sit for a moment, let Tommy stand there behind him, feeling the room, feeling the quality of Marco closing the door and remaining inside it, feeling the absence of any of the usual signals that a meeting was normal. He let all of that work before he turned. Tommy looked at him, and something in his face shifted very slightly. The way young men's faces shift when they've told themselves they're ready for something and then encounter the thing itself. "Sit down," Damiano said. Tommy sat. Damiano came away from the window and stood at the desk rather than sitting behind it, a choice, deliberate, that put him physically higher than Tommy and removed the desk as a buffer between them. He looked at the young man for a moment. 28 years old, the nephew of a man who had served Damiano's father with genuine loyalty for 16 years and died of a heart attack in 2019, still loyal. He had brought Tommy in partly as a courtesy to that memory, and partly because Tommy had shown, in the early period, a quickness that seemed valuable. "I'm going to ask you something once," Damiano said. "You're going to answer it honestly. That's the only version of this conversation that ends well for you. Do you understand?" Tommy nodded. His hands were flat on his thighs, pressing down slightly, steadying himself. "Serena Moretti," Damiano said. "When did she first contact you?" Tommy's jaw tightened. A small movement, involuntary. He looked at the desk's surface for 1 second and then back up at Damiano, and in that 1 second, Damiano watched him do the calculation, deny, negotiate, or confess, and watched him understand that the calculation was already over. 8 weeks ago," Tommy said. His voice was steady. Damiano gave him that. "How?" "She called me on my personal phone. I don't know how she got the number." "What did she want?" "Information about the schedule, who was in what meetings, what was being discussed, how you were—" He stopped, swallowed. "How you were handling things, personally. She wanted to know if I was distracted." "Yes." "And you told her." A pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds. "Yes." Damiano pulled a chair from the wall and sat down in it, directly across from Tommy, close enough that Tommy would have had to make a deliberate effort to look away from him. He kept his voice very even. "Why?" Tommy looked at him. His eyes were doing something complicated. Not remorse exactly, not defiance, something in between that was probably the closest he could get to honesty under the circumstances. "She told me you were going to restructure, that the distraction with her was going to make you pull back from the port operations, and that when you did, you'd consolidate and people at my level would be cut. She said she could protect me, give me a position with Traore's side of the operation. She told you I was going to cut you. She said it was likely. And you believed her. He stopped again. His hands pressed harder against his thighs. "I didn't know if I believed her. I thought if it was true and I hadn't done anything, I'd have nothing. And if it wasn't true and I passed information that didn't matter much, I'd have a relationship with my enemy," Damiano said. Tommy went quiet. "You traded 3 years of loyalty for a maybe," Damiano said, "because a woman you'd never met called you on the phone and offered you insurance on a threat that didn't exist." He paused. "Your uncle served my father for 16 years. He never asked for insurance. He never needed it." Something moved across Tommy's face at the mention of his uncle. Not shame exactly, something rawer than shame. "I need to know everything she asked for and everything you gave her," Damiano said. "Meeting times, attendee lists, topics discussed, my behavior, my schedule. All of it, every exchange, starting from the first call. You're going to tell Marco all of it today, and Marco is going to verify it against what we already know, and if what you tell him matches what we know, we'll discuss what happens next." He stood. "If it doesn't match, that's a different conversation." He walked to the door and opened it, and then stopped with his hand on the frame. The same position Serena had held 40 minutes ago, he noticed, without finding it interesting, and looked back at Tommy. "Your uncle was a good man," he said. "I'm going to try to remember that while I decide what you're worth to me now." He left Marco with Tommy and went downstairs. The drive to New Jersey took 40 minutes. Damiano drove himself, which he almost never did. He had drivers, had maintained drivers for 9 years as a security standard, but today he needed the 40 minutes alone in a car with his hands on something. He needed the physical action of driving, the small constant adjustments that occupied the mechanical part of his mind and left the rest of it free to work. Sal Benedetto lived in a house in Montclair that was modest by the standards of what Sal earned. A deliberate choice, Sal had always maintained a low profile in his personal life, which was part of why he'd lasted. Damiano pulled into the driveway unannounced at 11:45, and Sal answered the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses, which he took off immediately in the way men do when they don't want to appear caught off guard. "I need your port contact," Damiano said. "Pereira." Sal stepped back and let him in without asking why. That was Sal. He processed and then moved, no wasted breath. "What do you need from him?" "I need the Meridian freight connection closed, and I need it closed in the next 48 hours, quietly. No disruption to normal operations, no paper trail that touches us. Sal led him into the kitchen and poured coffee without asking if Damiano wanted it. That's manageable. What's the exposure? Traore has a logistics chain running through a shell company, Meridian, that interfaces with the Fabretti operation. The chain is the soft entry point he's been trying to use for access to our port corridor. If Pereira flags the Meridian container manifests as a regular at the customs level, the legitimate inspection process does the rest of it without our hands on it. Sal nodded slowly. Pereira flags it, customs opens it, and whatever's in those containers becomes a federal problem. Traore's federal problem. What's in the containers? I don't know yet, but a man who maintains a 13-year intelligence operation against a competitor and uses shell freight companies to do it is not shipping furniture. Sal drank his coffee. He looked at the table for a moment. This solves the port problem, he said. What about the source? Someone inside was feeding schedule information. That's being handled. Sal looked at him. He had known Damiano for 21 years, and he was good at reading the specific texture of Damiano's restraint. Tommy Caruso, he said. Damiano said nothing. Sal exhaled. I thought it might be. He'd been too interested in the Thursday meeting structure. Asked Nico what rooms we used, said it was for a facilities question. A pause. I should have flagged it. Yes, Damiano said. You should have. Sal accepted that. I'll call Pereira this afternoon. What's my timeline? 48 hours to flag. I need the inspection triggered before the weekend. Done. Sal stood and refilled his coffee. And the woman? Moretti? She'll be removed from the equation, Damiano said. Not physically. He said it because Sal's expression had moved slightly toward a question. She'll be given a reason to leave the city and not come back. What kind of reason? The kind that makes staying more dangerous than going. Sal nodded. He understood the architecture of it without needing the specifics. That was what 21 years of shared language built, the ability to discuss the shape of a thing without handling every edge of it directly. Damiano drove back to the city. He went to see Serena at 6 that evening. He went alone. No Marco, no driver, no recording device this time. This was not a conversation he intended to use as evidence because what he needed from it was not evidential. He went to the address he had for her, an apartment in a building on Pine Street, and rang the buzzer, and after a moment she let him in without asking who it was through the intercom, which told him she'd been expecting him. She opened the apartment door before he knocked. She'd changed out of the gray coat. She was in dark slacks and a plain sweater, and her hair was down, and the apartment behind her was sparely furnished in the way of someone who had never intended to stay long. A suitcase was visible through the bedroom doorway. Not packed, but present. You're ready to move, he said. I'm always ready to move. She stepped back to let him in. Come in. You might as well. He came in. He stood in the middle of the small living room and looked at the apartment, the blank walls, the functional furniture, the complete absence of anything personal or accumulated. A place a person lived in the way a bird lands on a wire, temporarily, without weight. Traore will cut you loose, he said. When the Meridian chain is flagged and the operation starts falling apart, and it will within the week, you become a liability to him. You know that. She stood by the window. The light from the street came through behind her. I know. Which means your value proposition ends. The thing that kept you useful to him ends, and a man like Traore doesn't maintain liabilities. I know, she said again. So I'm offering you something, once, and then it's off the table. He looked at her steadily. Leave the city tonight, not tomorrow, not the day after. Tonight, I'll provide documentation, a new identity packet, the kind that holds under standard scrutiny. Enough money to establish somewhere far enough away that Traore's reach becomes theoretical. He paused. In exchange, you give me every operational detail you have on his structure, not what you gave me in the office. Everything. Names, locations, financial channels, the contacts he's embedded in the port system beyond the Meridian chain. Serena looked at him for a long moment. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, not because she was bad at hiding it, but because she'd stopped trying to hide things from him since the conversation in the office. Some professional decision to dispense with the performance. Why would you protect me? She said. I'm not protecting you. I'm buying information and offering a transaction that's worth more to me than whatever satisfaction I might get from the alternative. What's the alternative? You stay in the city and I do nothing. And you wait to see whether Traore gets to you before the federal investigation does. She moved away from the window and sat down on the edge of the couch. She looked at her hands for a moment. He watched her and felt, strangely, almost nothing. No anger, no grief, none of the noise he'd expected. Just the clean, exhausted clarity of a man who has been running on adrenaline for a week and has finally arrived at a moment that is simply a transaction. The encounter at the house, he said. The night Elena saw us. He hadn't planned to say it, but it came out because it was the thing underneath everything else, the thing that had been sitting at the bottom of him since Ruiz's call. You set the location. You told me you needed to see me there specifically, something about the property having a structural issue you wanted me to look at for a contact of yours. I remember. Yes, she said. You knew she would follow me that night. I'd tracked her pattern for 2 weeks. She followed you on emotionally elevated evenings where she'd noticed behavioral changes. I made sure that evening read as emotionally elevated. How? I called your office twice that afternoon with questions that weren't urgent. Greta would have mentioned it to Elena. Greta mentioned everything. You know she does. 2 calls from an unnamed woman in one afternoon. A pause. I knew Elena would find a reason to follow. Damiano was quiet. The street sounds came through the window. Traffic, someone's music, the ordinary texture of the city going about itself. She wasn't supposed to be the casualty, he said. She wasn't part of whatever history exists between me and Traore. She married a man who came with complications she accepted because she trusted the man. She didn't sign up to be a component in someone else's operation. Serena said nothing. She spent 12 years, he said, building something in that house. Something real, that she built carefully, the way she built everything, without asking for recognition, without keeping score. And you looked at it, and you saw a structural weakness, and you took it apart because it was efficient. Yes, Serena said. Quiet, without defense. That's what I can't. He stopped. His jaw was tight. He breathed through it. That's the part that... He stopped again. She looked at him. Something in her face had changed during this, something very slight, something he could not have named. Not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of a person encountering something they had processed as abstraction and are now encountering as a human fact. I'll give you what you need, she said. All of it. And I'll be out of the city by midnight. Sit down at that table, he said. Start talking. She talked for 2 hours. He recorded it on his phone, asking questions when she moved through something too quickly, pulling her back to specifics when she generalized. She gave him Traore's organizational structure in more detail than he'd had before. The financial channels, the names of 3 additional embedded contacts in port-adjacent businesses, the location of Traore's primary operational hub in Atlantic City, and a secondary location in Delaware. She gave him the name of a federal agent Traore had compromised, which was information Damiano filed carefully for potential future use. She gave him the timeline of the operation against him, beginning to end. The initial planning, the decision to use Serena as the vector, the 13-year preparation, the moment in late August when Traore had determined the time was right and activated her. By the time she finished, it was past 8. The apartment had gotten dark around them, and neither of them had turned on a light. She sat at the table with her hands around a glass of water she hadn't drunk, and he sat across from her with his phone between them on the table, still recording. One more thing, he said. She looked at him. The night she signed the papers. She was alone in that house at 3 a.m, making the decision to leave everything she'd built. Did you know she would do it that night specifically, or was the timing hers? Serena was quiet for a moment. The timing was hers. I created the conditions. Everything after was her. So she chose, he said. She chose? Yes. He stopped the recording. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood up. The documentation and the money will be with you by 10, he said. Leave a number with me. Not yours. A clean one. Through a channel. If I need follow-up on any of this, I'll use it once. She nodded. He walked to the door. He stopped. "If you'd come back to me honestly," he said, "if you'd actually needed help and actually come to me, I would have helped you. That's not something I'm proud of, given everything. But it's true." She didn't answer. He left. The Meridian inspection was triggered at the port on Friday morning, 47 hours after Sal called Pereira. Damiano heard about it through Marco, a routine flag that had escalated when the inspectors opened 2 containers and found approximately $11 million in cash and documents connecting a series of financial instruments to operations in 4 states. By Friday afternoon, it was a federal matter. By Saturday morning, Traore's name was attached to the investigation in the language federal investigators used when they were genuinely interested rather than fishing. Traore himself had moved, as Serena had said he would. He was 3 steps ahead, and he had gone to ground when the Meridian chain started unraveling. But gone to ground was not gone. Damiano knew where he was. Serena had told him. He spent Saturday at the estate, alone. He walked through the rooms in a way he hadn't since Elena left, not looking for her presence exactly, but acknowledging the shape of her absence in each one. The formal dining room with its marble table, the kitchen with its good knives she'd selected herself, the garden, visible through the window, the rose beds he'd bought the house for, the bed she'd tended for 12 years. On Sunday morning, he drove to Morro Bay. He did not call ahead. He did not know what he was going to say. He knew only that she needed to hear what he knew, and that she deserved to hear it from him before she heard it from anyone else, and that driving 3 hours to say it was the smallest possible version of what he owed her. He found the bookshop on the main street without difficulty. A small town's main street held no mysteries, and he parked across from it and looked up at the windows above it for a moment. "Second floor," Marco had said. The window on the right had a light on. He got out of the car. He crossed the street and found the exterior staircase at the side of the building and climbed it to the landing and knocked on the door. He heard movement inside, then stillness. The quality of stillness that meant someone was standing on the other side deciding something. He stood on the landing with his hands at his sides and the cold November air coming off the water 2 blocks away, and he waited. The door opened. Elena Vescari, Elena Caruso, he corrected himself. She had become Elena Caruso. Stood in the doorway in a gray sweater and bare feet, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who is genuinely unsurprised and genuinely unafraid. And that combination was somehow the hardest thing he'd encountered in the entire preceding week, harder than Tommy's admission, harder than Serena's 2 hours of operational honesty. She simply looked at him, steady and complete and entirely herself. "Damiano," she said. Not a question, not a greeting, just his name, acknowledged. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why you left, about what happened." He paused. His breath was visible in the cold air. "I need you to know that the night at the house wasn't—" He stopped. His chest was tight in a way that was not physical. "It was real. What you saw was real. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't, but there are things surrounding it that you deserve to know, and I drove here to tell you in person because you deserve that much at minimum." Elena looked at him for a moment. Her face did several things very quietly, not readable exactly, but alive, processing, the particular expressiveness of a woman who has spent years managing what she let show and has perhaps, in the months since leaving, loosened that management slightly. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. The apartment was small and warm and smelled like coffee and something herbal, a candle or a plant, something living that she had introduced into the space to make it hers. That was Elena. She could not inhabit a place for more than 2 weeks without making it respond to her, without arranging something on a windowsill or hanging something on a wall or finding the exact right spot for a lamp that turned a functional room into a place a person actually wanted to be. Damiano noticed all of this in the first 10 seconds and said nothing about it. She closed the door behind him and moved to the kitchen area without asking if he wanted anything, and put the kettle on, and he understood that was how she was going to handle the first few minutes. The small, practical choreography of hospitality, because it gave her hands something to do and gave both of them a shape to move through while the larger thing settled into the room and found its dimensions. He stood near the door. He did not sit until she indicated the chair at the small table, and then he sat and put his hands flat on the table's surface and looked at them. She brought 2 cups and sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him with those steady dark eyes that had always been capable of more patience than he deserved. "Tell me," she said. He told her everything. He started with Ruiz's call, the 51 hours, the 13 years, the deliberate architecture of Serena's return. He told her about Traore, about the port operation, about the strategy of using personal destabilization as an entry point into organizational structure. He told her about Tommy Caruso and what Tommy had given up and why. He told her about the evening at Sal's house, the Meridian chain, the federal inspection. He told her about the 2 hours in Serena's apartment with the recording running and the lights going dark around them. And then he told her about the house. He told her that the location had been chosen, that the timing had been engineered, that Serena had mapped her patterns for 2 weeks, and had made 2 calls to his office that afternoon specifically because she knew Greta would mention them, and the mention would land in exactly the anxious, watchful space Elena had been living in for weeks. He said all of it plainly, without using it as mitigation, and without softening the parts that implicated him, because the only version of this conversation he could live with was the accurate one. Elena listened. She did not interrupt him. She held her cup and occasionally looked at the table and occasionally looked at his face, and her expression moved through things he could not fully read, not because she was hiding them, but because they were complex enough that they resisted easy reading, the way complicated weather resists a single description. When he finished, the silence lasted a while. "So she chose the night," Elena said finally. "She chose the location. She created the conditions." "Yes." "But what I saw was real." He held her eyes. "Yes." She nodded slowly, not the nod of someone receiving good news, the nod of someone confirming something they had already, on some level, understood. "I knew it was real," she said. "I need you to know that I didn't leave because I was fooled into thinking something was happening that wasn't. I left because something was happening. I know. I want to make sure you understand that." Her voice was even, not cold, but carrying a precision that meant she needed this said correctly. "Knowing what you've just told me, knowing she arranged for me to see it, knowing the whole structure of it, that doesn't change what I saw. It changes the context. It doesn't change the fact." "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" "Yes." He paused. "Elena, I'm not here to argue the divorce. I'm not here to ask you to reconsider. I drove here because you deserve to know what was done to you. What was done to your marriage, to your life in that house, by people who looked at what you'd built and saw a mechanism to dismantle. You deserve to hear it from me rather than find out some other way, or never find out at all." He paused. "That's why I came." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, a very small thing, a softening around the eyes that was not forgiveness exactly, and was not grief exactly, but was something adjacent to both, the expression of a person encountering honesty from a direction they had stopped expecting it. "How long did you know?" she said. "About what she was?" "I suspected the night outside the restaurant. I confirmed it 4 days later." "And between suspecting and confirming, what did you do?" "I put things in motion to verify. I didn't contact her. I wasn't." He stopped, his hands pressed flat against the table. "I wasn't trying to protect what was between us. There was nothing to protect. I was trying to understand what had been done, and to whom and by whom. That was all." "That's honest," she said. "It's the only thing I have left to offer you that's worth anything." She drank her coffee. Outside, the town was quiet, a small sound of wind off the water, someone walking on the street below, the particular stillness of a coastal town on a Sunday morning in November. Damiano sat in it and felt the exhaustion of the last 3 weeks come down on him all at once, the way exhaustion does when the adrenaline finally stops being necessary. "Carmela called me," Elena said. He looked up. 2 weeks after I left. She called my personal phone, the number she'd always had for me, not the house line. She said she was calling to tell me that whatever I'd seen and whatever had happened, she knew I had loved her son better than he'd understood, and she wanted me to know she knew that. She paused. "She also told me not to come back." Something tightened in Damiano's chest. "She told you not to come back." She said, and I'm giving you the exact words. She said, "Don't come back for him. If you ever come back for yourself. When you're ready, if you ever want to. But not for him. He doesn't get to be the reason you do anything anymore." Elena looked at the table. "That was the kindest thing your mother has ever said to me in 12 years. Damiano was quiet. He thought of Carmela in her house in Villanova, 73 years old, with her suspicions and her judgments and the long practice of loving a family of men who repeatedly failed to be what they should have been. And he understood that his mother had done in a single phone call what he had spent weeks unable to do. She had told Elena the truth about what she deserved and left the choice entirely with her. "She's right," he said. Elena looked at him. "She's right. You don't owe me anything, not your time, not this conversation, not the fact that you let me through that door. I came here because you deserved information. I'm not staying because I deserve anything from you in return." He pushed his chair back slightly. "I'll go. If there's anything you need, practically, legally, anything relating to the financial settlement, Marco knows how to reach me, and I will make sure it's handled exactly as you want it, without argument, without delay." He started to stand. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She set her cup down and looked at him with the directness she had always been capable of when she decided to use it. That quality of attention that made a person feel seen in the uncomfortably complete way, the way that didn't allow for performance or deflection. "I need to tell you something now," she said, "and I need you to hear it the same way I heard what you told me, without arguing it and without trying to find the version of it that feels better." "All right. I forgave you before you walked through that door," she said. "Not because of what you just told me, not because of Traore or Serena or the architecture of it. I forgave you 3 weeks ago, sitting in this apartment, because I understood that staying angry at you was going to cost me more than you were worth paying." She held his gaze. "I mean that without cruelty. I mean it as the most honest thing I can say. Forgiving you was something I did for myself. It had nothing to do with you." He nodded. "Once. What I cannot give you," she continued, "is a return. I cannot give you the marriage back, and I cannot give you the version of me that existed in that house, because that version made choices that I understand now and couldn't see then. She chose to stay inside something that was slowly making her invisible, and she told herself it was love, and sometimes it was, but it was also habit and fear and a definition of loyalty that had more to do with her own stubbornness than with what was actually good for her." She paused. "I'm not that woman anymore. 2 months in this apartment, in this town, with these people who don't know anything about what I came from. I'm not that woman anymore, and I don't want to be." "I know," he said. "The divorce is final in 31 days, she said. "I'd like to let it be." "Yes," he said, immediately, without hesitation. Because the only thing he could do for her now that carried any weight was to make that easy, and he was going to make it as easy as a thing like that could be made. She looked at him. Something in her exhaled. Not quite relief, but the release of a tension she had been holding since she heard his knock on the door, the tension of not knowing what he would ask for. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for not making it worse," he said. "That's not something that deserves thanks." For the first time in the conversation, something crossed her face that was almost a smile. Not warm exactly, but real, the recognition of a man who had said something accurate about himself, which had always been the thing she'd found most difficult to get from him and most valuable when it came. They sat together for another 40 minutes. They talked. Not about the marriage, not about Traore, not about what came next for either of them, but about the town, which she had found by driving until she felt like stopping, and about the bookshop downstairs, whose owner was a 70-year-old woman named Ruth, who had given Elena part-time work cataloging an estate donation of 3,000 books without asking any questions about her background or her reasons. They talked about Carmela, briefly, and Damiano told her his mother had called him after their conversation with the specific instruction that he was not to use Elena's forgiveness as permission to be careless with the next person he loved. Elena laughed at that, a real laugh, short and quiet, and said that sounded exactly right. When he stood to leave, she stood too. She walked him to the door. He put on his coat and she opened the door, and the November cold came in off the water. He stopped on the threshold. He looked at her. "The garden," he said. "At the estate. The rose beds. I haven't. He stopped, started again. I don't know what to do with them. She looked at him for a moment. Ask Carmela, she said. She knows what they need. He nodded. He went down the stairs. He heard the door close above him. Not hard, not soft, just closed, with the finality of something that was complete. He crossed the street to his car and sat in it and looked up at the lit window on the second floor for a moment. Then he started the engine and drove back toward the city. The federal investigation into Vincent Traore's network became official 9 days later. The Meridian containers yielded enough documentary evidence to generate indictments across 3 states. Traore himself was arrested at a secondary property in Delaware, the one Serena had identified, on a Thursday morning in late November, taken by federal agents before he had finished his coffee. Damiano heard about it through channels and did nothing to involve himself further. The evidence existed independently of him. That was how he had structured it, and it held. Tommy Caruso left the organization. Damiano made that offer rather than the alternative, partly in memory of Tommy's uncle, and partly because Tommy had, in the end, told Marco everything accurately. The full picture matched Serena's account on every point. He gave Tommy money enough to start somewhere else, and the strong recommendation that somewhere else be far, and Tommy took it without complaint, which was the wisest thing the young man had done in his brief career. Marco handled the internal reconciliation. The captains were told enough of the truth to understand what had been done to the organization and by whom, and the understanding served as its own kind of stabilizer. Sal Benedetto told Damiano afterward that the Thursday meeting that had felt most dangerous, in retrospect, had been the one where Damiano had walked in and not explained himself and simply demanded accountability, because it had reminded the men in that room that there was someone at the head of the table who was paying attention. Damiano filed that observation away without comment. The Fabretti situation was resolved in December, with the quiet application of the pressure that had always been available and which Damiano had been holding back as a strategic patience that had been misread as indecision. With Traore's network collapsing and the external backing gone, the Fabrettis made an accommodation that left them exactly where they'd been before the dispute began. No one got more than they'd started with. No one lost face publicly. It was the kind of resolution that was invisible from the outside and permanent in its effects, which was the best kind. He dismantled parts of the organization through the following year. Not all of it. He was not naive about what complete dismantling would mean, or whether it was genuinely possible for a man in his position after 2 decades of construction. But he reduced it with a deliberateness that surprised his people, and eventually stopped surprising them. He withdrew from territories that required active maintenance to hold and generated revenue that cost more in risk than it returned. He closed channels that were irreplaceable if lost and replaceable if closed voluntarily. He moved money into structures that were legitimate enough to survive scrutiny and that employed real people doing real things. He was not performing redemption. He had no audience for it and wanted none. He was making the decisions that a man makes when he has stopped spending his energy on things that no longer seem worth the cost of keeping them. Marco stayed. Sal stayed. The organization that remained was smaller and quieter and considerably more careful, and it held together because the people in it had chosen to stay rather than because leaving was impossible. Carmela came to the estate for Christmas. She walked through the garden in the December cold and looked at the rose beds, which had been properly tended since November. He had asked her, as Elena suggested, and she had told him what they needed with the pragmatic specificity of a woman who had grown roses in South Philadelphia since 1978 and did not consider the subject romantic. She walked through the garden and said nothing about Elena, and said nothing about what the year had been, and at dinner she ate the food he had cooked himself, badly, but with effort, and told him the sauce needed more time and poured herself more wine. It was, he thought, the most honest evening they had spent together in years. He did not contact Elena again after Morro Bay. He received the finalized divorce decree by courier in January. She had been organized about it, as she was organized about everything, and the paperwork was complete and correctly filed and required nothing from him but his signature, which he gave the same day it arrived. He sat at the desk in the study where he had sat with the first set of papers 100 days earlier, and signed his name and gave it back to the courier and did not allow himself to sit with it longer than was necessary. He sent one message, through Marco, to the intermediary channel Serena had left. One question: did she make it out? The answer came back in 2 words. She had. He did not send another message. He had said he would use the channel once. He used it once. The bookshop in Morro Bay closed briefly for renovation in February and reopened in March with an expanded second floor. Elena had apparently been involved in the redesign. Ruth, the owner, had mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone, the way things travel in small towns when someone has made a genuine impression. Elena had drawn up the shelving plan herself, had organized the new stock by a system that made Ruth's existing inventory finally findable, had spent 3 weekends painting the interior of the addition in a color she'd described as the exact blue of the water at 7 in the morning when the light was still deciding what it wanted to do. Damiano heard this from Marco, who had heard it from the person still quietly monitoring her safety. Not surveillance, not interference, simply the maintenance of a perimeter that would tell them if anyone with a reason to find her did. Traore's network was dismantled, but dismantled structures left fragments, and he was not going to be careless with her safety because he no longer had the right to call her his wife. He listened to Marco's report. He said, "Good." He said, "Make sure that arrangement stays invisible to her." He said nothing else about it. He was glad she had found the color of the water at 7 in the morning. Spring came and the estate's garden came back with it, the rose beds emerging from the winter protection Carmela had specified with the particular stubbornness of plants that have been properly cared for. Damiano spent an hour on a Saturday morning in April doing something he had never done in 12 years of owning the property. He worked in the garden himself, not skillfully. With a pair of gloves and the instructions Carmela had written out and left him, and a willingness to be bad at something without minding. He thought about Elena while he worked. He did not feel the need to resolve the thinking into anything useful or declarative. He just let it move through him the way the work moved through him. The physical repetition of it, the soil and the effort, and the small visible results of attention applied consistently over time. This was what she had known, he thought. This was what she had understood about the garden, and about the house, and about the marriage, and about him. That the things worth keeping required consistent, patient, unspectacular attention, the kind that didn't announce itself and didn't ask to be noticed, the kind that showed up every day and did what needed doing. He had not understood that while she was there to do it. He understood it now, on his knees in the garden she had loved, doing the work too late and doing it anyway, because it was still the work, and the work still mattered whether or not the person he'd learned it from would ever see it done. The following autumn, he saw her. He was in a town he'd had no particular reason to visit, except that a piece of business had brought him within an hour of the coast, and he had, without fully examining the decision, driven the additional hour rather than heading directly back. He was not going to Morro Bay. He had not planned to go to Morro Bay, he told himself, and believed it as far as it went, which was not entirely far. He parked on the main street and walked. It was an October afternoon, cool and bright, the kind of day that felt conclusive, the end of something, the season making its intentions clear. The leaves had turned and the water down at the end of the street was very blue, and the light had that particular slant that came in October and made everything look like a photograph of itself. He saw her from half a block away. She was standing outside a restaurant on the opposite side of the street, talking to a man he didn't recognize. Mid-40s, roughly his own height, the kind of face that looked easy to be around. They were talking the way people talk when they have been talking comfortably for a while and have not run out of things to say. As Damiano watched, the man said something and Elena laughed. Not the controlled laugh she had used in social situations, not the polite laugh she had deployed at his business dinners, but the other one. The laugh that came from being genuinely surprised by something being funnier than expected. The laugh he had heard perhaps a dozen times in 12 years because he had so rarely been the one to produce it. She looked well. She looked, he thought, like herself. More herself than she had looked in the last several years of the marriage. The way a person looks when they have stopped spending energy on maintenance of something that is costing them and have redirected that energy simply into being. Her hair was different, slightly. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, a deep green that suited her. She did not see him. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and watched her, and he felt something move through him that he had no clean name for, Not grief exactly, because grief implied a surprise, and there was no surprise left. Not quite peace, because peace would have been too easy, and he had not earned easy. Something between the two, something honest. The feeling of a man who has arrived at the exact truth of a situation and is finally, after considerable delay, accepting it in full. He turned and walked back to his car. He did not look back. He had learned that from her. He drove back to the city in the October light, and the road was long and mostly empty, and he drove it with his hands steady on the wheel and his mind quiet in the way it had not been quiet for the better part of 2 years. The kind of quiet that is not emptiness but settlement, the particular stillness of things that have stopped moving and found where they belong. He thought about what Serena had said, sitting in the dark apartment with her packed suitcase in the next room. She was the right choice. She always was. You just never looked at what you had directly enough to know it. He thought about what Carmela had said on the phone 10 months ago, in the voice she used when she was telling a truth she'd been holding for a while. She loved you more than you deserved. I'm your mother. I'm allowed to say that. He thought about Elena at 3 a.m, making coffee before she left. The coffee she had made not for him but out of some deep, durable habit of decency, leaving the pot warm in a house she was walking out of for the last time, because she was the kind of woman who noticed what other people might need, even when those people had given her no reason to keep noticing. He had not deserved that. He had not, in the end, been able to hold it, but he had seen it clearly now, which was something, not enough, not anything close to enough, but something. The beginning of a kind of accounting that a man could do honestly if he was willing to stop looking away from what the numbers showed. The city appeared ahead of him as the road curved, the lights coming on in the early dusk, the skyline familiar and indifferent and full of the ongoing life of a place that did not require his presence or concern itself with his particular reckoning. He had built something in that city, and parts of it had survived, and parts of it had been dismantled, and what remained was smaller and quieter, and he thought, more honest than what it had been. That would have to be enough. He did not know if it was. He drove toward the lights and let the question sit with him, unanswered, the way the truest questions always sit, not demanding resolution, just presence, just the willingness to keep carrying them honestly into whatever came next. The road leveled out. The city opened up around him. He kept driving.